Welcome back to Project Command. I'm Captain Peter Eunice, and I'll be your host. On today's episode, we're going to talk all about what fire chiefs and executive officers need to know in 2026 to use AI and ChatGPT specifically more effectively. But first, if you're enjoying this podcast, please like, follow, or share this episode with a friend. Remember that every share helps more fire service professionals learn the skills and mindset to deliver stronger, smarter projects. And if you have a question or a topic you'd like us to cover, send us an email at projectcommandpodcast@gmail.com. That's projectcommandpodcast@gmail.com. We'll do our best to answer it either directly or on air in a future episode. Now, let's get to the show. So guys, today we're going to talk all about what chiefs and chief officers need to know about ChatGPT and AI more broadly. Now, this episode builds off of a previous episode I did called ChatGPT for Firefighters. Now, in that episode, I started with a lot of the basic stuff. So maybe for people that aren't as familiar with AI, how it works, how predictive text works, and all that kind of stuff. And if you want to kind of start at the beginning, I really recommend that you go back and listen to that episode first, because that's a lot more of the 101 stuff. I would consider this episode a little bit more kind of 200 or 300 level. Just consider that. If you want to kind of go back and start at the beginning, ChatGPT for Firefighters is one of my earlier episodes. And if not, let's just get into the 200 level stuff here. So, because this episode is going to be directed a little bit more, in fact, a lot more at chiefs and chief officers, we're going to cover different use cases than we did on the ChatGPT for Firefighters. Particularly, what I want to focus on for this episode is research and strategic decision-making, data and data aggregation, and policy development and synthesizing documents. And these are, so to take a step back, just a little bit about kind of me and my role in all this, and a little bit about my background is right now I am the executive officer for an ISO Class 1 internationally accredited metro department. And in my current role, I have the opportunity to work very closely with our executive leadership team, which is our deputy chiefs, our fire chief, and our chief of staff. And I have a real front row seat into how these decisions that are happening at that level get made, and some of the obstacles and barriers that often we run into at that level. And AI is something that I've really embraced for a long time now. I like to consider myself an early adopter. I went to a 6-month program at Vanderbilt called Generative AI Strategy and Leadership. I believe that was in 2024 I did that. And since then, I have been looking for ways that we can use AI as a force multiplier. And so what I did for this episode is I put together some of the things that I have found AI to be the most effective at assisting executive leadership teams with. And so that's kind of why I picked those things to focus on. And so with that, let's start with research. And I kind of lumped together research and strategic decision making. And here's why. So, first off, let's define some terms. Strategic decision-making, people just love the word strategic. They like putting strategic in front of things, strategic communication, strategic decision-making. And when I use the word strategic, what I'm referring to is kind of like that systems thinking. So, if we change this, how will it impact that and that and that? So second and third order effects. Anybody can make a decision, but strategic decision-making looks at the impacts of those decisions. How will this affect our workforce, our community, our 5-year plan? How will it impact these programs? So just a more wholesome and comprehensive look at the impacts of our decisions. Excuse me. So when we talk about strategic decision-making, it's really important that we don't make those decisions in a vacuum. We're not the only fire department out there. We're not the only people that have dealt with these problems. And so a lot of times strategic decision-making requires us to look at what are other departments doing, what's worked what research is available to support these decisions or maybe to discourage these decisions. And then we take all that information in, as well as input from trusted stakeholders. And we put all that together, we synthesize that information, and we use it to make strategic decisions. And to give a little bit more detail on what I mean, or what some examples of some of those strategic decisions, think about like maybe you're using a software to handle your staffing and you want to switch to a different software, or at least you're considering switching to a different software. This is a big decision because this is going to impact like a ton of different aspects of your fire department. And so you want to be thoughtful and you want to consider, a bunch of good information and get as much, information as you can from other departments. The old thing, like, how does it go? That old expression, a fool never learns from his mistakes. A smart man does learn from his mistakes, and a wise man learns from other people's mistakes. So, we want to look at what other departments have done and take that into consideration because maybe they've made a mistake that we don't have to make. Or it could be, your union wants to go to a 24/48 and you're currently on a different schedule and you want to look at what are the impacts going to be of switching to a different schedule. Or, maybe you want to put another fire station or open another fire station and you're trying to figure out where it should go. Or any big decision or even a small decision that's going to impact your organization. So now that we've kind of set the table on how strategic or what constitutes a strategic decision and why they're so important to get right and what kind of information you want to think about when you're making them, let's talk about how ChatGPT and AI can help. Now, research, generally speaking, can take a long time and it can be complicated. And that's because it's not just a matter of looking through all the research and just being like, okay, this looks good and this doesn't. Very often, before you can find research that is relevant to you, you have to read a lot of stuff. There'll be a study or an article and it'll look like maybe this is kind of what we're talking about here. But then you get into it and you're like, man, this doesn't really apply to me, or this isn't really useful at all. And sometimes even just finding that stuff can be really hard. I mean, you can Google it, that kind of stuff, but that's difficult. And, coming from someone who's been doing a lot of research over the last few years on project management frameworks and concepts, I can tell you that finding the stuff to actually read is often the majority of the battle. And AI is so good at that. So you want to set clear parameters. And so this is how I might go about that. Let's say you want to make a decision about Telestaff or, whether to implement a software like Telestaff. What you could do is you could go into ChatGPT and you could set some really good parameters. And you might say something like, I'm looking into switching our staffing software from this, whatever we're using, to Telestaff. I want to determine how Telestaff has worked in departments similar to mine. So I want to find research or articles or any supporting information that you can find from departments between 400 and 800 members with between 20 and 30 stations that have switched from one staffing software to another, particularly Telestaff. I want 5 to 10 pieces of peer-reviewed information, whether that's articles or research, that can help me make this decision. So that's how we would kind of frame that prompt up. And what I would also put at the end, and I really like kind of adding stuff like this when I'm doing research, is list citations or links so that I can click on the source documents to review them. And I would also add, accuracy is critical for this prompt because sometimes ChatGPT prioritizes just giving you an answer versus necessarily an accurate answer. You've probably heard stories of lawyers that use ChatGPT and it just made up case law. And that's because it just thought, hey, the most important thing is to give an answer, not an accurate answer. So I might add something in the end like accuracy is critical. All the articles that you reference must be real articles, they must be peer reviewed, and I must be able to review the source documents. So adding that at the end is kind of like a little protection for yourself, and it's also a way for you to fact check what you're looking at, which I would recommend doing for sure. So now what you've done is you've taken what could have taken 4 or 5 hours to sift through the whole internet's worth of research and articles, and now you have a list of 5 or 10 pieces of research with a link so that you can click on the source document. You can ask it to give you a quick executive summary on what were the questions that this research looked into, what were the key findings. And so you can look through these very quickly now. You have 5 or 10 things you can read. And what you'll notice here is ChatGPT is not doing the research for you. It's just aggregating the information so that it's easier for you to do the research. And it's certainly not making the decision for you. It's important that we don't use ChatGPT to make decisions because it really only looks at things from sort of a myopic or single factor analysis, and it often can struggle to take into account things like human impacts and stuff like that. So we don't want to use it as a decision making tool. We rather would like to use it to gather information to support the decisions that we're going to make. Now, the other side of this research is imagine that we're putting together a proposal for maybe our city council or our board of supervisors, and we want to support what we're saying with some research. So we've done our own, review of our data, and we want to start up a new program, which is, I don't know, let's just say we want to start up a community paramedicine program. And we want to find some data that shows, hey, when other departments like ours or other communities like ours have started similar programs, these are the benefits, these are the reductions in 911 calls, et cetera. So we might do that, a similar prompt. Hey, this is what we're looking to do. We want to implement a community paramedicine program, find research from communities similar to mine that have implemented similar programs, and what have the results been? And again, you want to put all the little kind of provisos in there. Must be accurate, must be real research, must include links for the source documents. Accuracy is critical, all that kind of stuff. By the way, save those prompts. If you write a good research prompt, copy paste it, save it in a folder so you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. It takes a little bit of effort on the front end, will save you a massive amount of effort on the back end. So now you can find, 3 or 4 pieces of data or studies rather, and you can say, okay, you read the study, you go, yeah, this is great. This is kind of like showing this department, saw a 25% reduction in this or a 5% reduction in that or whatever. Then you can put together an executive summary with the help of ChatGPT, and you can include that in your presentation. And this just gives a little bit of research and a little bit of data to help support what you're suggesting or proposing to your elected leadership or whoever makes the decisions in your community. So in any case, quick recap there. We want to essentially use ChatGPT to help aggregate things for us to read and research so that we don't have to spend the majority of our time looking for the information. It can help get all that information in one place, and then we can spend the majority of our time reading through relevant information that is what we are looking for to help us make more informed decisions. Okay, let's move on to a different topic. Data. Now, pretty much every fire service agency or public safety agency will say we're a data-driven department, or at least we're a data-informed department. Now, being data-informed or data-driven is essentially a 3-part process. First, you need to figure out what data you need. Then you need to figure out how do you collect that data. Then after you've collected it, you need to figure out how do you interpret it. And ChatGPT can help with pretty much every step of the way. So let's start with what data do we need? So one of the things that I really like using AI for is just helping me figure out, I guess the best way to put it is like, how big is the problem? So what I might do is I might say, ChatGPT, give me a list of 25 different things data could tell me about my department. And it would list, data could tell you your response times. It could tell you give you a heat map. It could tell you where the majority of your calls are coming from. Data might tell you, are you moving faster to calls or slower? So it would just list this great big giant list of all the things that you could collect data on. And I would look through it and I would say, all right, well, we can't do everything. We don't want to, aim too big and cast too broad a net and end up with way more data than we know what to do with. So let me pick a few things that are really important to me. Okay, so something like that can just, it's not going to pick the data for you. It's just going to say like, hey, look, these are all the things you theoretically could collect data on. Okay, and maybe that list of 25, maybe make it 50. Just go through and pick a few, or meet, better yet, meet with your leadership team and just say, hey, what's important to us? What are we aiming at in our 5-year plan, or just even, over the next year? Okay. Now, how do we collect that data? This is really, really important because there's a lot of ways you can collect data, and the best data collection tends to be automated. Just gives you casts a broad net, gives you a large trove of data, and so you might list off all the different software that you use, most of which has built-in data collection in it, and you might say, hey, if we wanted to collect these 4 or 5 pieces of data, how would we go about doing that? And, it can just list, oh, hey, this software has this built-in data collection functionality and this one has this, and this is how you can get these two things to talk. And of course, look, obviously, having professional data experts, whether that's a data scientist or a data engineer, is going to be critical because, you don't want to kind of amateur hour this thing. This is good to kind of get an idea. And just like with anything else in the IT world, it's better to go to your IT folks, and I include data in the IT folks. It's better to go to them with the problem rather than the solution, and to just say, hey, look, this is what we want to collect. How do you suggest we do it? But of course, ChatGPT can help point you in the right direction. And critically, and this is the one that I really wanted to talk about, how do you understand what your data means? So some departments are very fortunate in that they have they have a robust data section. So here in the great state of Virginia, a great example would be Fairfax County Fire Department has numerous people that work almost exclusively on data. And that's a huge value add, and kudos to them for making that investment. But not everybody is fortunate enough to have the resources for something like that. And so very often your department may have just 1 or 2 data people, or, in the case of smaller departments, maybe none. And if that's the case, then it's very difficult once you have that data to figure out what it means. And of course, there's ways you can, have your staff get better at data. And I think Coursera, which is an online learning platform, is an absolutely phenomenal way to, let's say you have your captain of planning. You say, hey, look, I want you to take 1 hour out of your day. I want you to do this free Coursera class on data management. It'll take you 12 weeks, and at the end, you'll have this certification and you'll have a good understanding of data. I just think that's a phenomenal way for chiefs to invest in modern skills for their workforce. But let's not go down that rabbit hole right now. Maybe we'll do an episode on that, on Coursera and platforms like it. But okay, so you need to understand what your data means. So here's what you can do with that. And so just one more thing I want to say about that. A lot of times when we do automated data collection, we end up with these huge piles of data. So you'll have an Excel table with, 1,000 fields in it or something like that. That's, intimidating. It's difficult to sift through. And it's going to take a data scientist or a data engineer to really sift through that and give you actionable information, or data visualizations, dashboards, whatever you want. But, you can get a sneak peek at what that data is indicating with ChatGPT. So, if you open up the ChatGPT app, whether it's on your phone or your computer, you'll see that there's a little plus sign in I believe it's the bottom, or so the left side corner of the chat box. And you can click that plus sign, and then it allows you to add files to the conversation that you're having with ChatGPT. Now you can add files off of your computer, which is how I like to do it. So I will, I'll save, just for ease, I'll save these things right to the desktop so they're easy to find. And then I'll just add those files straight into the, and of course, I have to say this. I have to say, do not put anything into ChatGPT that is considered sensitive information. So the way I look at it is, if it's available on a publicly facing website or it can be FOIA'd, then I consider it safe to put into an AI model because it's public information. Okay, I have to throw that out there. Okay, so you add from your desktop the file that you want it to review, and you say, here's how this data was collected. This is the purpose of collecting this data. Give me an executive summary and a brief overview of what this data indicates. Now, here's something I'll add at the end. Accuracy is critical, and I would like you to explain your methodology and what data points you used to reach these conclusions. Now, this gives you, of course, the ability to go back and check. Does it make sense what it's suggesting? So it'll say, I used this data point in conjunction with this one and this one and this one to reach this conclusion. So you can review that methodology and you can say, okay, that makes sense, or that doesn't make sense. And then if it doesn't make sense, you can say, well, listen, when it says, R1, that's rescue one, that's a fire suppression unit, not an ambulance. Redo your calculation to take that into account, okay? Because sometimes it'll make mistakes like that. So again, ChatGPT is not a data scientist, and I would never suggest that you replace your data scientist with ChatGPT because, again, you don't want to amateur hour this thing. But what it can do is help you get a better sense of what you're looking at. Because, a lot of times if you send that Excel table to your data people, that could take a week or 2 weeks to get back like a real solid data visualization. So this just gives you a way to get a sneak preview of what that data is telling you, or at least just figure out even, hey, are we on the right track with what we're collecting? Or do we need to kind of go back to the drawing board and maybe collect some different pieces of data? Okay, let's switch gears. Now I want to talk about policy development and synthesizing documents. So this is something that happens a lot at the executive level, and it can come in a bunch of different forms. Let's focus first on policy development. Now, this is something that's going to happen every single year, in perpetuity for every fire service agency. So let's say you're wanting to update an old policy. Maybe you have a uniform policy and, it was last updated 4 or 5 years ago, and you're like, all right, we really got to update this thing to include a bunch of new things. So maybe you put together a work group and you say, hey, go through the uniform policy and figure out what needs to get changed. Maybe send out some surveys, check in with HR, whatever you need to do, figure out what we want to change. And maybe they say something like, okay, we want to update our tattoo policy. We want to add in that, this type of jacket is acceptable. We want to, change the hair policy, whatever you want to do. And they come back with a list of 25 recommendations and they say, okay, this is what we want to update in the policy. And you run it through the hopper, you check in with HR, they say, yep, looks good to us. So now you need to integrate those changes into an existing policy. So there's a bunch of different ways you can go about doing this using AI or ChatGPT to help you. So first, this is the maximalist way to use it. You can say, click on that little plus sign that we talked about, add in the old policy. So save it to your desktop, then click the little plus sign, add it into the AI model, and then add in the Word document with all your proposed changes and say, explain, you always have to, okay, I should have started with this. You always have to explain what it's looking at, and it'll figure it out on its own, but you get much better results if you say, I have attached 2 documents. The first document is our existing uniform policy created in 2018. The second document that I have attached is a Word document with 25 recommendations to add into that policy. I would like you to take the Word document with 25 updates, and I would like you to integrate that into the existing policy to create a cohesive and consistent policy which has all of the things in the existing or the previous policy, but also integrates and what's the right word? Whatever, makes it so that it's consistent with the new stuff or whatever, however you want to word that. Okay, so now one quick thing I would always add is list every change in bullet point format that you have made to the document. So that now I can go back and review it. I can say, okay, did it add it the way I want? Okay, yes. Did it add it in the section that I wanted in? Yes. So have it list where the changes are made. That way you can kind of direct your attention more in a more focused way to those sections. Okay, so that's kind of one way you can go about it. Another way is, let's say you have your working group go ahead and make those changes on their own. But one of the things you always want to check with policies is this consistent? Because maybe the old policy says only jackets issued by the fire department can be worn. But Now you've added in that Carhartt jackets can be worn, but you forgot to take out a sentence in one of the sections that says no non-department jackets can be worn. But then, 5 sections later, it says these are the approved Carhartt jackets that can be individually purchased. Well, that's a contradiction. That's going to lead to confusion at the company officer level. It's going to lead to issues on the line. So you want to make sure that it's consistent and you didn't leave any of those little landmines in there. So what you can do is you can say, ChatGPT, here's the new policy that has all the things updated in it. I want you to scan this and look for inconsistencies in this policy, and then give me a bullet point list with page number and section and what it's inconsistent with. So this is just a second set of eyes to go through and make sure that all the things that you've listed are consistent with one another so that you don't run into those issues. And, 2 months after you roll the policy out, people say, hey, are we allowed to wear these personally purchased jackets or aren't we? Because it says two separate things. Now you got to redo the policy and re-roll it out. And you look silly. So you just don't want to do that. So it's a great way to kind of make sure that everything you've put is consistent. Now let's talk about how we synthesize documents. So what I mean by that is, well, I guess I'll just give you an example. So about a year ago, I was working on a project to open up a pharmacy for our fire department so that we would be compliant with some new federal laws that had just been passed, the Drug Supply Chain Safety and Security Act, I think it was called. In any case, it doesn't really matter. And so we wanted to write a white paper on how to be compliant so that we could assist some of our partners in the region. And so myself, as well as our operational medical director and our director of EMS, set out with the task of writing this white paper. And so the EMS director wrote just a brief summary of, hey, how did we get here? What are the changes that led us to this point? And our operational medical director wrote another section, and then I wrote some other sections. So now we have 3 documents that we need to combine into one. Okay, so this is what I mean by synthesizing documents. We have 3 separate documents. We want to turn it into one document. So, hit that little plus sign. So save them all to your desktop. Save, this is the part written by this person. This is the part written by this person. This is the part written by this person. Okay, now you save them to your desktop so they're easy to find. Click that plus button and add all 3 documents. And of course, explain what you're looking at. Hey, this is this section, this is this section, and this is this section. Now, if you have a specific way you want that organized, you got to tell it. You can say, hey, I want to start with how did we get here? I want to start with the operational concerns, and then I want to finish with this section or this section. And lay out the flow that you want it to have, and then add in any other stuff. Hey, I want it to have a table of contents. I want it to have a section for, the appendices section. Now, synthesize these documents. Now, a couple of things that you want to add, because ChatGPT will sometimes add in stuff that it might think is missing. And if you don't want it to do that, if you just want it to strictly combine these documents and add nothing of its own, you've got to say that, okay? So you might say, I would like to combine these 3 documents. I do not want any external information that is not included in these 3 documents to be added. It is critical that the information listed in these 3 documents be reflected exactly as it's written, just reformatted to fit together, or something like that, to prevent ChatGPT from, taking some liberties and adding in a little bit of meat on the bones where it thinks it needs it. So great way to take multiple documents. And just think about this. If you had to take 3 documents and combine them together and, kind of go through and make sure it all makes sense, this could be an hours-long proposition. Okay, but if you use ChatGPT to synthesize those documents, this could be 5 or 10 minutes. Then you spend a few more minutes reviewing it. Obviously, maybe not a few more minutes. You spend a little bit of time reading over it, making sure you like it, tweaking it, all that kind of stuff. Remember, ChatGPT almost never gets you 100% of the way. You want it to get you, 60% of the way, and then, you take it the rest of the way. It's kind of a good way to look at it. So great way to synthesize documents, save yourself some time. Great way to assist with updating an old document. And even if you're writing a brand new policy, you have all the feedback you've gotten from whatever working group you put together. Plus, you might attach a few of your HR policies and say, this new document must be compliant with this, and this policy, and any other information you think ought to go in there. And you can say, give me a rough draft or an outline of this new policy. Of course, you got to review it. It's going to get you 60% of the way there, not 100. But what this does is it takes what tends to be a very time-consuming part of executive day-to-day, which is drafting new documents, and it can make it a much faster process. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about today is using ChatGPT to help you structure your meetings. Now, this is something that I really like because, one of my pet peeves is when you go to a meeting and it's not well structured and it ends up being a waste of everybody's time, or you get into the meeting, nobody prepared for the meeting, nobody knew what the meeting was really about. So you have to spend, if it's an hour long meeting, you got to spend the first 15 minutes kind of getting everybody up to speed, giving the context, and then you can get to work. I don't really like that. I like to give everybody the information that they need so that they can show up to my meetings ready to work, so that we can make the most of our time and that we can be respectful of people's time. If I said the meeting's going to be an hour, I don't want it to go for an hour and a half. I want to get done in an hour. So, what I like to do is use ChatGPT to either put together meeting agendas or to put summaries of documents. Like, for example, let's say you're meeting about changes you've made to your EMS response model, and you want to review with this group how these changes are impacting service delivery and whether any tweaks need to be made. Now, you might want to review some data. So you might want to say, this is our response times. This is our, 911 gets dispatched to first patient contact time or whatever. And you have a bunch of data. So you might want to have ChatGPT put together executive summaries of that data or something like that. That way you can send that information out at the same time as you send that meeting invitation. So you go on Microsoft Outlook or whatever you use, you pick the people, you pick the time, and then you attach those documents and just say in the meeting description, hey guys, I've attached some summaries of the data that we're going to be discussing. Please review this data prior to coming to the meeting so that we can be ready to work when the meeting starts. Okay, this is a great way to get more out of your meetings because people are going to show up ready to work. But also what you can do is you can say to ChatGPT, this is what I'm hoping to accomplish in this meeting. I'd like to leave with a decision on this, this, and this. Or I'd like to get everybody thinking about this so that the next time we meet, we can make a decision on that. Give it the intent of the meeting, give it the information that you're going to cover in the meeting, and then some basic stuff like, hey, here's who's going to be present in the meeting and stuff like that. And what you can then do is have it put together a rough agenda. Now, it'll include times like introduction, 5 minutes, review of data, 15 minutes. I don't like that because, it's going to take as long as it takes. And I don't like those kind of arbitrary time limits on things. So I'll just say, I don't need it to be time boxed. I just need a rough agenda so that people have a sense of this is what the meeting is going to cover and this is what you can be expected to talk about or whatever. So I'll have it put together a rough agenda. And I will also attach that agenda to the invitation for the meeting. So if I send an invitation for a meeting, and not always, but what I like to do is, hey, here's the agenda for the meeting. This is a summary of the data we're going to be talking about, and this is what I'd like you to discuss at the meeting or whatever. And so first off, this just is a professional way to run a meeting. Okay, this is just a good organized way so that you can get the most value out of your meeting. But this also just helps you be respectful of people's time so that you don't run over, and it also helps people show up ready to work. So this is a great way to utilize ChatGPT to do what you were going to do anyway. It's not like you don't have to have the meetings. This just ensures that they are high quality meetings and you actually get what you want out of them. So guys, that's the time that we've got today, but I want to finish by saying that I'm really interested in what other people are using ChatGPT or whatever your preferred model is. And I'll just say we talked a lot about ChatGPT just because it's kind of the most well known. But I like a lot of other AI models. I've talked to a lot of chiefs that like Claude. The Grok model is really cool. If you want something that's a little bit more, I guess, has more proprietary information. Microsoft Copilot is a great option for some things. So in any case, ChatGPT is the title of this episode, but that doesn't mean it's the only one that I use or the only one that I would recommend. And again, I did a whole episode with a lot of basics on how these predictive models work and how they're structured and how to build prompts and the difference between a prompt and a parameter and all that stuff. It's called ChatGPT for Firefighters, so check it out. But also, the one thing I was going to say is please feel free to share. In fact, please do share what you're using ChatGPT for, because I would love to have dialogue about this, and I'd love to maybe do a future episode where we include some of what the audience is using it for to kind of share some of that knowledge. This is an emerging technology, and the use cases are limited by your imagination. So I'd love to hear what you guys are using it for. Well, thanks for joining us for today's episode of Project Command. Again, I'm Captain Peter Eunice, and if you have questions or topics you want us to cover, send us an email at projectcommandpodcast@gmail.com. Thanks again for being here.